stop checking the 3D. Every glance is a decree that you still doubt. Ignore the echo, and watch how fast the state hardens into fact. Most people believe they are making progress only when they can see something changing. They wake up, scan their world, check their phone, check their bank account, check how someone is treating them, and they silently ask reality a question: is it working yet? This habit feels natural, logical, even responsible, but it is the very mechanism that keeps manifestations stalled. The moment you look to visible 3D evidence as your confirmation, you have already placed causation outside of yourself. You have unknowingly agreed to let the reflection decide the movement of the face. And Neville Goddard was uncompromising about this point. Nothing changes on the outside first, ever. Neville's foundation was simple, yet devastating to the logic of the senses. Consciousness is the only reality. What you experience as the world is not an independent force negotiating with you, rewarding you or withholding from you. It is a delayed mirror, responding faithfully, but not instantly, to who you are being aware of yourself as. The delay is not punishment, and it is not chance. It is simply the time it takes for a state assumed internally to work its way through the layers of form. When you misunderstand this delay, you misread silence as failure and neutrality as resistance. Think carefully about the mirror Neville so often spoke of. You do not smile at a mirror after it smiles at you. You move first. The reflection must follow. There is no exception to this rule, yet when it comes to life, people reverse it constantly. They wait for the reflection to prove something has changed within them. They wait for the world to reassure them that their assumption is valid. But the mirror has no choice. Once the movement is made, the reflection is inevitable. The only variable is whether you keep turning your face back to see if it has worked. This video is about the exact inner moment when that turning stops. Not because you are forcing yourself to be patient, and not because you are pretending not to care, but because something far more decisive has happened internally. There is a precise shift, quiet, subtle, and unmistakable, where reality stops feeling like something you are pushing against and begins to feel like something already in motion on your behalf. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. But once it occurs, resistance dissolves because there is nothing left to resist. Dr. Joe Dispenza describes this moment from a neurological and biological angle when he speaks about breaking the addiction to the current reality. The body, conditioned by repetition, becomes emotionally attached to familiar circumstances, even unwanted ones. The senses report what has been and the body says, "This is real." To ignore that feedback is not denial. It is the act of withdrawing loyalty from a past identity. When Neville tells you to walk by faith and not by sight, he is not asking you to be naive. He is asking you to stop letting yesterday's state dictate today's assumption. This is where so many teachings become diluted. People hear phrases like, ignore the 3D and mistake it for positive thinking, forced optimism, or mental suppression. That is not what Neville taught. Ignoring the 3D is not pretending circumstances do not exist. It is recognizing that they do not cause anything. They are effects, echoes, residual impressions of former assumptions. You do not fight an echo. You do not negotiate with it. You simply stop shouting the old sound. The promise of this work is not that you will become emotionally numb or detached from life. The promise is far more radical. It is that there comes a moment when you no longer feel the need to look for reassurance because the inner decision has already been made. Not a hope, not a wish, a decision. Identity-level causation begins exactly there, when the question shifts from "is it coming?" to something far quieter. Of course, when that inner acceptance locks in, the world has no choice but to reorganize, not because you are trying harder, visualizing longer, or affirming louder, but because the cause has been settled. Neville was clear. An assumption, once accepted as true, will harden into fact. The key word is accepted, not repeated, not argued for, not defended against appearances, but accepted in the same way you accept your own name. You do not wake up each morning checking for proof that it is still yours. So as we begin, understand this clearly. This is not a lesson in patience. It is not an encouragement to wait longer or hope better. It is an explanation of authority, spiritual authority over appearances, time, and evidence. The moment you stop asking the mirror for permission to change is the moment reality quietly begins working for you. From an early age, you were trained to believe that proof comes first, and belief follows. You were taught that reality must demonstrate its intent before you relax, before you trust, before you allow yourself to feel secure. This conditioning runs so deep that it feels like common sense. If something is real, you should be able to see it. If something is working, there should be signs. If something is changing, there should be evidence. Yet this entire framework quietly contradicts everything Neville Goddard taught about how creation actually functions. The demand for proof is not neutral. It is an inner position. It says, I will believe when the world convinces me. And the moment that agreement is made, causation has been handed over to appearances. You are no longer operating as consciousness directing form. You are reacting to form and asking it for reassurance. Neville warned repeatedly that this posture keeps people trapped in endless waiting, not because the desire is unreachable, but because the inner authority required for its fulfillment has been postponed. Imagine a radio operator sitting at a control panel, turning the dial back and forth, growing increasingly frustrated because no music is coming through immediately. The station is already broadcasting, uninterrupted and stable, but the operator keeps adjusting the frequency because silence feels like failure. Each adjustment delays the moment of alignment. The irony is that the very act meant to get confirmation is what prevents reception. In the same way, constantly checking the world for proof pulls you out of the state that allows manifestation to lock in. This is how most people live their inner lives. They assume a state briefly, then look outward to see if it worked. If nothing appears, they adjust, doubt, re-strategize, or abandon the assumption altogether. What they never realize is that the assumption was never given time to become natural. It was treated like a test instead of a decision. Neville was explicit. An assumption only becomes creative when it is occupied, not when it is inspected. The lie about proof is subtle because it disguises itself as wisdom. It sounds reasonable to say, I just want to know it's working. But this desire to know is rooted in mistrust of imagination. It implies that imagination is a hopeful fantasy that must be verified by facts, rather than the causal substance from which facts emerge. When you accept this lie, you unknowingly reverse the creative order and force yourself to wait for an effect before allowing yourself to embody the cause. So if proof does not come first, then what actually signals success? It is not a sign in the world, it is not a message, a coincidence, or a sudden shift in circumstances. The real signal is internal, and it is quiet. It is the moment you stop feeling the urge to check, the moment you no longer feel compelled to ask reality how it's going, the moment the assumption feels settled enough that looking for confirmation would feel unnecessary, even slightly strange. That is the reversal Neville pointed to again and again. Creation does not respond to effort or vigilance. It responds to acceptance. When acceptance occurs, the need for proof dissolves on its own, not through discipline, but because something has been resolved. And it is only from that resolution that the outer world can begin to reorganize itself without resistance. There comes a point in this understanding where something quietly turns inside you. Until then, life feels like a negotiation between what you want and what the world is willing to show you. You imagine, you hope, you try to believe, but the facts seem louder. Neville Goddard called this divided consciousness, when the inner claim and the outer evidence are in conflict, and the senses are still given the final vote. The great reversal happens when that vote is withdrawn. Neville taught that an assumption, once accepted as true, must objectify, not might. Not eventually if circumstances allow, must. This is not poetry or metaphor, it is a law. Yet acceptance is often misunderstood as repetition or emotional intensity. In truth, acceptance is closer to legal recognition than emotional excitement. It is the quiet acknowledgement that something is now so, regardless of whether you are currently experiencing it. Consider what happens when a legal deed is signed. Ownership is established in that moment, not when you receive the keys, not when you walk through the front door, and not when the furniture arrives. The house may still be occupied, the paint may not be changed, your name may not yet be on the mailbox. Yet none of those facts have the authority to reverse the deed. The inner acceptance has already overridden the outer situation. This is how manifestation actually works. When you accept a state as yours, the external world may lag behind. just as paperwork, inspections, and logistics lag behind ownership. But the lag does not indicate doubt, resistance, or failure. It is simply the echo of a former arrangement playing itself out. The problem arises only when you misinterpret the lag as evidence that acceptance has not occurred, and you attempt to re-sign the deed again and again. Most people fail to sustain acceptance not because it is difficult, but because it feels unfamiliar. The mind has been trained to stay alert, to monitor conditions, to remain vigilant for change. Acceptance, by contrast, feels almost irresponsible to the conditioned self. It feels like letting go of control. It feels like closing the case before the verdict is announced. Yet this is precisely why it works. Acceptance removes the inner argument. When acceptance is genuine, outer facts lose their emotional charge. They may still be visible, but they no longer carry authority. You can see them without consulting them. You can acknowledge them without identifying with them. This is not indifference. It is hierarchy. Consciousness has been placed back at the top, and appearances have been returned to their proper role as reflections, not decision-makers. The great reversal, then, is not about denying facts or pretending circumstances are different. It is about recognizing that facts are downstream. They report what has already been assumed, not what is being assumed now. When inner acceptance becomes stable, the outer world is left with only one job: to catch up. If this is reshaping how you see reality, subscribe and stay aligned as the mirror continues to change. There is a moment that does not look like success from the outside, yet it marks the turning point of everything. It is not loud, emotional, or dramatic. No fireworks go off in the mind. In fact, if you are expecting a rush of excitement, you will likely miss it. Neville pointed to this moment again and again, describing it as the shift from wanting to being, from longing to quiet possession. It is the instant desire no longer feels like something ahead of you, but something already accounted for. Wanting is active. It leans forward. It watches the horizon. Being, on the other hand, is settled. It does not scan the environment for reassurance, because it no longer needs feedback to justify itself. When this shift occurs, the internal dialogue changes without effort. The mental question of when will it happen dissolves, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer makes sense to ask it. The desire feels finished, even if nothing has visibly changed yet. Neville often described this as the feeling of the wish fulfilled. That phrase has been misunderstood and diluted over time, reduced to emotional highs or visual intensity. But the feeling he referred to was not excitement. It was familiarity. It was the naturalness that comes when something has been internally accepted as fact. Just as you do not feel emotional about having two hands, you do not feel emotional about a state that has been claimed as yours. A simple analogy makes this clear. When you place a meal in the oven and set the timer, there may be a brief moment of anticipation. But once you know it is cooking properly, you stop checking. You do not stand in front of the oven questioning whether heat is still being applied. You move on with your life. The knowing replaces the watching. The outcome becomes assumed, not monitored. This is the exact moment reality starts working for you, because the inner resistance has ended. Resistance is not opposition from the world. It is the inner state of wanting something to happen instead of knowing it is happening. The world mirrors that wanting with delay and uncertainty. When wanting collapses into being, the mirror has no conflicting instruction to follow. Importantly, this shift does not come from effort. You cannot force yourself into being by repeating affirmations louder or visualizing longer. Effort belongs to the state of wanting. The doorway into being is different. It opens when the assumption has been accepted deeply enough that it no longer feels like a technique you are applying, but a conclusion you have reached. From that point forward, life begins to move in subtle ways. Conversations change. Opportunities arise. Circumstances rearrange themselves through sequences you could not have planned, not because you are controlling them, but because the cause has already been established. Reality is no longer being asked to comply. It is simply responding to a state that has been internally finalized. There is a reason Neville placed such importance on the moments just before sleep. It is not superstition, ritual, or habit. It is structural. In the state akin to sleep, the sharp edges of the conscious mind soften, and the senses lose their grip on authority. The world of facts, logic, and memory recedes into the background. and imagination steps forward without needing to argue its case. This is why Neville called SATs the natural doorway into the subconscious. During the day, the mind acts like a customs officer, inspecting every idea that tries to enter. SAT asks where it came from, whether it makes sense, and whether it agrees with past experience. Most imaginal acts are denied entry under this scrutiny. At night, however, that officer steps aside. In the drowsy, floating state before sleep, imagination passes freely. Scenes are accepted without interrogation, and feelings register without resistance. Neville understood that the subconscious does not reason, it accepts impressions. When an imaginal act is entered in SATs, it bypasses the analytical mind and is received as a fact. This is why a short, simple scene, repeated gently until it feels real, can have far more impact than hours of daytime effort. The state itself does the work. Resistance dissolves not because you fight it, but because it has no foothold there. Yet many notice something puzzling. They enter SATs at night, feel the fulfillment, and drift into sleep with a sense of completion. Then morning comes, and with it the old thoughts. The same circumstances are visible. The same habits of mind attempt to reassert themselves. Doubt appears, not because the imaginal act failed, but because the senses have returned to their usual position of authority. This is where misunderstanding often arises. Doubt does not cancel what was impressed. The subconscious does not revoke an assumption because the conscious mind questions it later. What matters is not the absence of all contrary thoughts, but the presence of a dominant acceptance. The imaginal act, once planted, continues to operate beneath awareness, regardless of surface-level reactions. SATs work so effortlessly because it aligns with the way consciousness naturally creates. It does not demand constant reinforcement. It requires only that the assumption be entered as real. Once that is done, the role of the conscious mind is no longer to make it happen, but to avoid undoing it through habitual identification with appearances. This is why Neville emphasized falling asleep in the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Sleep seals the impression. The body relaxes, the senses disengage, and the assumption sinks into the deeper layers of being. From there, it begins its work, independent of your daily opinions about how or when it should appear. Just when an assumption has been impressed, just when the inner decision has been made, the senses seem to grow louder. This is not coincidence, and it is not failure. Neville referred to this tension as divided consciousness, the state in which the inner claim has shifted, but the outer world is still displaying the remnants of an old agreement. The senses, loyal to what they have known, attempt to pull attention back to familiar ground. The adversary in this process is not the world itself, but the habit of believing appearances without question. The senses report facts, but they do not report causes. They show effects already in motion, not the new state that has been accepted. Yet because they are immediate and vivid, they feel persuasive. When they present the same circumstances again, the mind interprets this as resistance, when in reality it is simply inertia. Neville described this loyalty to appearances as the greatest obstacle to conscious creation. The senses argue convincingly. They say, nothing has changed, and they are technically correct. Nothing has changed yet. But this accuracy is deceptive because it ignores the causal level where the change has already occurred. To side with the senses at this stage is like consulting yesterday's newspaper for today's weather. An image clarifies this dynamic. Imagine a former employee who has already resigned, signed the paperwork, and mentally moved on. The job, however, still exists. The building is still there. The routines still run. If that person keeps showing up, responding to old expectations, and behaving as if the resignation never happened, the departure remains incomplete. The outer environment has no opportunity to reorganize around the new status. Doubt often intensifies near the finish line because the old state is losing its foundation. It has no future, only momentum. As it runs out of energy, it makes one final appeal for attention. This appeal is not a signal to engage, analyze, or correct. It is simply the echo of a former identity attempting to persist. Manifestation succeeds not because doubt never appears, but because doubt is no longer given decision-making power. It may pass through awareness, but it is not consulted. The assumption remains intact beneath the noise. When consciousness is no longer divided, When appearances are no longer treated as authority, the senses gradually fall back into alignment, and the world adjusts accordingly. Once an assumption has been accepted and impressed, something begins to move that you cannot see. Neville called this movement the bridge of incidents, a sequence of seemingly ordinary events that leads from the inner decision to its physical expression. This bridge is not dramatic, and it is rarely recognized while you are crossing it. It unfolds logically, naturally, and often invisibly, precisely because it is not meant to be managed. From the perspective of the senses, nothing appears to be happening. Days may pass with no obvious shift. Conversations seem unrelated, circumstances look unchanged, but beneath the surface, conditions are being rearranged in ways that could not have been predicted. People are being influenced, decisions are being made, and paths are aligning without your awareness. The absence of visible movement does not mean inactivity, it means coordination. An analogy helps here. Imagine a line of dominoes falling in another room. You do not see the sequence. You do not hear each piece fall. There is only a silence, followed by the sound of the final domino hitting the floor. To the listener, it seems sudden. To the one who set it in motion, it was inevitable. The bridge of incidents functions the same way. You only notice the end because the middle was never meant to be observed. This is why Neville warned against interfering with the process. Attempts to control how or when things happen are rooted in mistrust of the assumption. When you try to direct the bridge consciously, you step back into the state of wanting, monitoring, and correcting. The bridge does not require your effort. It requires your non-interference. Its intelligence exceeds what the analytical mind could design. Often the bridge looks nothing like the desire itself. It may involve delays, detours, or events that appear contradictory. Yet each step is necessary, even if it feels unrelated at the time. What matters is not whether you recognize the bridge, but whether you remain identified with the state that set it in motion. The bridge responds to identity, not to opinion. When a desire feels larger than circumstances, this understanding becomes essential. The scale of the manifestation does not change the law. A greater outcome does not require greater effort or more visible progress. It requires the same acceptance, the same surrender of control, and the same trust in the unseen movement of consciousness. The bridge will always match the assumption, no matter how improbable the circumstances appear. At a certain point, something subtle but unmistakable occurs. The desire that once occupied so much mental space begins to lose its urgency, not because it has been abandoned, and not because you have lowered your expectations, but because it has been internally integrated. Neville referred to this as the Sabbath state, the moment of rest that follows creation. It is not inactivity, it is completion. When a state has been fully accepted, it feels natural, and naturalness is quiet. It does not announce itself, it does not seek validation, it simply is. This is why emotional intensity fades. The excitement that once accompanied the desire gives way to neutrality, and that neutrality is often misinterpreted as loss of faith. In truth, it is the clearest sign that the inner work is done. An analogy makes this clear. Imagine wearing a ring every day for years. At first, you are aware of it constantly. You feel its weight. You notice its presence. Over time, that awareness disappears. The ring has not fallen off. It has become part of your sense of normal. The same happens with an assumption that has been claimed. It blends into your identity until it no longer feels like something you are thinking about, but something you are thinking from. In this state, the mind stops rehearsing conversations, visualizing outcomes, or questioning timing. Not because discipline is being applied, but because there is nothing left to resolve. The desire no longer feels separate from you. It does not feel like a future event. It feels like a settled fact waiting for expression. Neville emphasized that this Sabbath is essential. Creation, in his teaching, is always followed by rest. The rest is what allows the assumption to externalize without interference. When you rest from desire, you also rest from doubt, effort, and mental negotiation. The inner argument has ended, and the outer world is left to play its part. This neutrality is not the end of the journey. It points to something deeper. When the desire no longer defines your emotional state, attention naturally shifts inward. The question moves beyond what you want and toward who you are. And it is at that level that Neville's teaching reveals its most profound implication. There is a subtle shift that happens after manifestation has done its work, and it often arrives quietly, without ceremony. The desire that once felt central, even urgent, no longer commands attention in the same way. It has either been fulfilled or, more precisely, it has been absorbed into your sense of self. What remains is not disappointment, and not even triumph, but a strange clarity. You begin to notice that the relief, the peace, and the sense of completion you were seeking were never truly located in the external outcome. They were always produced by the inner state you occupied to receive it. Neville referred to this unfolding realization as the promise, and it represents a movement beyond the mechanics of manifestation into a deeper recognition of identity. At first, the law is approached as a means to change circumstances. You learn to assume, to imagine, to feel fulfilled. Results follow, reinforcing the truth of the teaching, but over time a pattern emerges that cannot be ignored. Each manifestation delivers the same inner conclusion. The satisfaction does not last because it was never dependent on the thing itself. What lasts is the knowing that consciousness is primary. This is where desire reveals its true function. Desire is not evidence of lack, it is evidence of movement within consciousness. It points toward a state that already exists as a potential identity. When you assume that state, the desire dissolves, not because it has been denied, but because it has completed its task. The object of desire was never the end. It was the bridge that guided awareness into a new level of being. An analogy brings this into focus. Imagine playing a game you believed you were trapped inside, struggling to win, frustrated by obstacles, thrilled by small victories. When the final level is completed, you discover something unexpected. You were not just the player. You were also the designer. The challenges were not punishments, they were prompts. The reward was not the trophy at the end, but the realization that the entire structure existed to awaken you to authorship. Winning changes you, not because you now have something, but because you now see differently. Neville taught that repeated conscious creation leads inevitably to this insight. Each successful assumption builds confidence, not in technique, but in being. You stop asking whether imagination works, because experience has answered that question repeatedly. What replaces it is a deeper inquiry into the nature of the one imagining. Who is the I that assumes? Who is the awareness that moves from state to state? As this question matures, the emotional dependence on outcomes weakens. This does not mean life becomes flat or indifferent. It means it becomes lighter. Desires still arise, but they are no longer loaded with the same urgency or desperation. They are seen as invitations, not necessities. You recognize that entering a state is enough and that the world will follow in its own way and time. This understanding dissolves the sense of pressure that once accompanied wanting. Creation becomes natural rather than effortful. Over time, this recognition reshapes how you relate to reality itself. You no longer experience the world as something happening to you, but as something happening through you. Circumstances lose their power to define your worth or stability. They become expressions rather than authorities. This is why Neville emphasized that the law prepares the way for the promise. The law trains consciousness through experience. The promise awakens it through recognition. At this stage, manifestation is no longer used to prove anything. There is nothing left to convince. The creative process becomes an extension of identity, not a strategy for improvement. You assume states because it is natural to do so, not because you are trying to escape something. Desire is no longer the engine. Awareness is, and it is here that the teaching returns to its simplest form. When the desire has done its work and fallen away, what remains is I am. Not as a concept and not as a philosophy, but as a lived recognition. Being precedes having. Identity precedes experience. This realization does not demand effort or discipline. It emerges when the noise of wanting quiet and attention rests where it has always belonged. Neville's teaching resolves into a single principle. The world reflects who you are being, not what you are seeking. Ignoring the 3D is not denial, but authority, the refusal to let effects dictate cause. Like a mirror, reality can only follow an inner movement already decided. Identity must change before environment can. When the assumption feels complete and natural, effort ends and reorganization begins. Dare to assume you are what you want to be, and the reflection will follow.